They said it couldn't be done, that the American M4 Sherman was no match for the fearsome German Tiger, yet one gunner's unconventional method would prove them all wrong. The battlefield innovation that followed would save countless Allied lives and help turn the tide of war. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The morning of July 24th, 1944, dawned with a leaden sky over Normandy. Rain pattered against the metal hull of the Sherman tank, washing away some of the dried mud, but leaving the shrapnel scars untouched. Staff Sergeant Frank Novak wiped condensation from the periscope, his oil-stained fingers leaving smudges on the glass. A former engineer from Ford's River Rouge plant in Detroit had learned to see the world through this narrow viewport, a far cry from the sprawling assembly lines he once supervised. "Visibility's poor, Sarge," Private Jaime Walsh muttered from the gunner's position, his Iowa accent thick with fatigue. The quiet farm boy clutched his Bible briefly before returning his hands to the controls. "Just keep your eyes sharp," Frank replied, scanning the hedgerows that formed a natural labyrinth across the French countryside. These ancient barriers of earth and tangled vegetation, meant to divide farmlands centuries ago, now served as perfect cover for German armor. The column of 5 Shermans rumbled forward, their engines growling in the morning mist. Miguel Rodriguez, loading shells with practiced efficiency, crossed himself quickly as they approached a gap in the hedgerow. The father of 4 from San Antonio had developed this ritual at every potential engagement point. Lieutenant David Chen's voice crackled over the radio from 2 tanks ahead. "Rawhide actual to all units. Maintain formation through the next sector. Intelligence reports minimal resistance." Frank frowned at the assessment. Intelligence had been wrong before, fatally so. The lead Sherman had barely cleared the hedgerow when it happened. A flash in the distance, followed by the unmistakable crack of an 88mm cannon. The shell struck with devastating precision, tearing through the front armor of the first vehicle. Fire erupted instantly, orange flames shooting from the hatches as ammunition cooked off inside. Before anyone could react, a second shot rang out. The tank directly in front of Novak's erupted in flames, its turret blown completely off by the force of the internal explosion. Back up now!" Frank shouted, his voice steady despite the chaos. Rodriguez muttered a prayer in Spanish as Walsh reversed the vehicle behind the protective wall of earth and vegetation. Through his periscope, Frank caught a glimpse of movement over 1,600 yards away, impossibly far for effective Sherman fire. The distinctive angular silhouette of a Tiger I tank, partially concealed behind a distant farmhouse. The survivors gathered behind the hedgerow, faces blackened with smoke and shock. No one spoke as they watched the flames consume what remained of their comrades' vehicles. "How are we supposed to fight that?" a young replacement whispered, his hands trembling. Frank stared at the distant Tiger, his engineer's mind already calculating angles and probabilities. The German tank's reputation wasn't just propaganda, it was a mathematical reality of superior armor and firepower that had just killed 8 Americans in less than 30 seconds. The rain drummed against the canvas tent as Staff Sergeant Frank Novak hunched over a wooden ration crate, his calloused fingers stained with engine oil and graphite. The day's losses weighed heavily on his shoulders, but his mind was already racing ahead, searching for solutions where others saw only death. He'd scavenged a chocolate wrapper, the last Hershey bar having been shared among the crew hours earlier, and now its brown surface was covered with precise lines, angles, and notations. "The Tiger's main gun has a traverse rate of 4 degrees per second, he muttered, sketching another diagram. "If we approach at this angle..." His pencil moved with the precision that once made him valuable at Ford's River Rouge plant, where engineering problems had clear solutions, unlike the chaos of war. Private Jaime Walsh sat quietly on an ammunition crate nearby, watching his commander work. The young gunner from Iowa clutched his dog-eared Bible, thumbing the worn pages that had accompanied him from his family's farm to this hell of mud and fire. Walsh's eyes moved between the sacred text in his hands and Novak's improvised blueprints, finding an unexpected connection between them. "It's like a pattern, sir," Walsh finally said, his voice barely audible above the rainfall. "Like there's an order to it all." Novak looked up, momentarily startled by the interruption. "What's that, Walsh?" "Your diagrams," the gunner replied, gesturing toward the chocolate wrapper. "They remind me of how my pastor used to talk about God's design, everything having its purpose and place." He opened his Bible, revealing margins filled with his own neat handwriting. "I've been keeping notes too, sir. Different kind, I suppose." The sergeant's expression softened. "Maybe not so different. We're both looking for answers." Outside, the distant rumble of artillery punctuated their conversation. Walsh flinched slightly but continued. "Do you think it'll work? Your plan?" Novak studied his calculations again. "The math makes sense. The Tiger's powerful, but it's predictable. If we can exploit its weaknesses, slow traverse, limited visibility, we might stand a chance." The tent flap suddenly opened as Miguel Rodriguez ducked inside, shaking rain from his helmet. A loader's usually cheerful face was drawn with fatigue. "Any word from Lieutenant Chen's platoon?" Novak asked. Rodriguez shook his head. "Nothing yet, Sarge. Captain Morrison wants to see you at 0600. Novak nodded, turning back to his diagrams. As Rodriguez settled on his bedroll, Walsh leaned closer to the sergeant's makeshift drawing board. "I believe Providence guided you to this," the gunner whispered, his faith finding purpose in Novak's calculations. "These aren't just lines, they're our way home." In the dim light of a single lantern, the three men shared a moment of quiet hope, while outside, the war waited for morning. Dawn broke over the hedgerows with the color of spent brass. July 25th brought no relief from the previous day's slaughter, only the promise of more. Lieutenant David Chen adjusted his position in the commander's hatch of Rawhide 4, his face a mask of determination despite the knot in his stomach. Orders had come down. Another frontal assault through the narrow lane that bisected two dense hedgerows south of St. Lo. "By the book, gentlemen," Captain Morrison had emphasized during the pre-mission briefing, tapping his finger against the tactical manual. "Standard column formation. Maintain intervals of 20 yards. Chen's crew knew what that meant. They would be leading the charge straight into the waiting maw of German armor. His gunner exchanged a nervous glance with the loader, but neither spoke. What was there to say? Doctrine was doctrine. "Rawhide 4 moving out," Chen reported over the radio, his voice steady despite everything. The Sherman's engine growled as it lurched forward, followed by 4 other tanks of the 745th Battalion. The narrow French lane offered no room for maneuver, exactly as the tactical manual prescribed, and exactly as the Germans anticipated. From his position in the third tank, Frank Novak watched Chen's Sherman advance with growing dread. The morning fog was burning off, revealing the deadly geometry of the battlefield. Novak could almost see the invisible lines of fire converging on their position. "They're walking us right into it again," he muttered to Jaime Walsh. The gunner nodded grimly, clutching his Bible with one hand while keeping the other on the firing controls. The Tiger revealed itself with a flash of orange flame from nearly 1,000 yards away. The sound reached them a split second later, a thunderous crack that seemed to split the sky. Chen's tank shuddered as the 88mm shell struck its front armor, penetrating cleanly before detonating inside. Rawhide 4 erupted in flames, its ammunition cooking off in a secondary explosion that sent its turret cartwheeling into the air. "Back up! Back up!" Novak shouted, but it was too late for the second Sherman. Another flash, another thunderous report. 2 burning hulks now blocked the narrow lane, trapping the remaining tanks. By afternoon, the men of the 745th were digging graves in the hard Norman soil. Miguel Rodriguez worked silently, tears streaming down his dirt-smeared face as he thought of his children back in San Antonio. Would they grow up without a father? The loader paused to look at Novak, who stood apart from the others, staring at the blackened Sherman carcasses. "Command says we try again tomorrow," Captain Morrison announced, his weather-beaten face betraying no emotion. "Same approach, different time." Novak felt something harden inside him. He watched the men digging graves and knew with absolute certainty, if they kept following doctrine, none of them would live to see August. The canvas tent behind the lines buzzed with tension as rain pattered against its surface. Staff Sergeant Frank Novak stood before a group of weary officers, his fingers smudged with graphite from the diagrams he'd spent the night perfecting. The makeshift briefing room, little more than a few folding chairs and a wooden crate serving as a table, fell silent as he spread his sketches across the surface. "With all due respect, sir, we're losing men because we're predictable," Novak said, pointing to his crude but precise drawings. "The Tigers know exactly where we'll come from and when, but they have weaknesses. Poor visibility from the commander's position and an extremely slow turret traverse rate." Captain Morrison leaned forward, his weather-beaten face betraying nothing as he studied the papers. The company commander's uniform was as immaculate as one could manage in the mud of Normandy, a stark contrast to Novak's oil-stained hands. "What are you proposing exactly, Sergeant?" Morrison asked, his voice carrying the weight of too many letters written to families back home. Novak traced his finger along the diagram. "A flanking maneuver, sir. Instead of charging head-on as the manual dictates, we split into teams of 3. One Sherman creates a distraction while the other 2 circle wide through these hedgerows." He tapped the paper. "The Tiger can't swing its gun fast enough to target multiple threats from different directions." Lieutenant David Chen, who had lost 2 tanks from his platoon the previous day, nodded slowly. "The math checks out," he said quietly. "If we time the radio signals precisely—" "Enough!" Morrison cut him off, straightening his back. "This isn't Detroit, Novak. We don't improvise on the battlefield. There's a chain of command, and orders from division are clear." The captain rubbed his temples. "We don't deviate from the manual, Novak. That's how accidents happen." Miguel Rodriguez, who had squeezed into the back of the tent, exchanged glances with Private Jaime Walsh. Both men had seen the burning Shermans, had helped pull charred bodies from the wreckage. Walsh clutched his Bible tighter, knuckles white. "Sir," Novak persisted, "we've lost 11 tanks in 3 days following protocol. The Tigers are picking us off." "I said enough." Morrison slammed his palm on the crate. "I understand your frustration, but I won't authorize cowboy tactics that could get more men killed." His voice softened slightly. "I appreciate your initiative, Sergeant, but we follow orders." "Dismissed." As the meeting dispersed, the men filed out in silence. Chen placed a hand briefly on Novak's shoulder before departing. The weight of bureaucracy settled over them like the damp Norman air, suffocating hope, preserving only the certainty of more funerals to come. The morning of July 26th brought a heavy silence to the American tank crews. 2 days of losses had hollowed out the men's spirits. Staff Sergeant Frank Novak sat atop his Sherman, binoculars scanning the rolling Normandy landscape, his mind calculating possibilities that doctrine never considered. "Movement, 3 o'clock, he whispered, spotting the unmistakable silhouette of a Tiger tank prowling along a supply road. The German behemoth moved with predatory confidence, its crew likely assuming the Americans would follow their predictable patterns. Novak made a decision that violated every protocol in the manual. Without radioing for permission, he slid down into his commander's seat and addressed his crew. "We're going to try something different," he announced, tracing a route on his map. "That orchard to the east gives us cover for a wide flanking maneuver." Miguel Rodriguez crossed himself quickly. The loader from San Antonio had 4 daughters whose photos he kept tucked in his helmet. "Captain Morrison will have our stripes for this," he muttered, but his hands were already preparing the shells. "Better court-martialed than cremated," Novak replied, the ghost of a smile crossing his face. He turned to his gunner. "Jaime, when we break cover, You'll have maybe 3 seconds before they traverse their turret." Private Walsh nodded, his Bible secured in his breast pocket. The quiet farm boy from Iowa had the steadiest hands in the battalion. "I'll be ready, Sarge." The Sherman's engine growled as they veered off the designated route, cutting through an unguarded apple orchard. The vehicle crushed fallen fruit beneath its treads, the sweet smell mixing with diesel fumes. Rodriguez whispered prayers in Spanish, his words keeping rhythm with the tank's movement. As they reached the edge of the trees, Novak gave the signal. The Sherman burst from cover, engine screaming as it accelerated across open ground. Through his viewport, Novak could see the Tiger's turret beginning its painfully slow rotation. "Now, Jaime." Walsh's hands moved with practiced precision. The Sherman's gun barked once, the shell striking the Tiger's flank where the armor was thinnest. A fountain of sparks erupted as the round penetrated. The German tank shuddered to a halt, black smoke pouring from its engine compartment. Its crew began bailing out through hatches, hands raised in surrender. For several seconds, no one in Novak's tank spoke. Then Rodriguez broke the silence. "Mother of God," he whispered, "we actually killed it." The radio crackled with Captain Morrison's voice, demanding to know their position and status. But the men were transfixed by the sight before them, a disabled Tiger, brought down not by superior firepower, but by breaking the rules of engagement. Novak knew there would be consequences for his insubordination, but as he watched the German crew surrendering, he also knew something far more important. The Tiger was not invincible after all. Word of Frank Novak's unsanctioned victory spread through the camp like wildfire. By evening, a crowd had gathered behind the supply tent, where the tankers huddled around a battered jeep, its hood transformed into an impromptu blackboard. Mud-splattered men leaned in, their faces etched with equal parts skepticism and desperate hope. "Gentlemen," Novak began, his oil-stained hands gripping a stub of chalk, "what I'm about to show you isn't in any manual." The former engineer from Detroit drew a rough outline of a Tiger tank, its imposing silhouette recognizable to every man present. Lieutenant David Chen stood at the edge of the group, arms crossed but eyes attentive. Captain Morrison lingered in the shadows, officially disapproving, but making no move to disperse the gathering. "I call it the Texas two-step," Novak continued, sketching arrows around the Tiger. "It's not about hitting harder. It's about moving smarter. 2 Shermans flanking fast, one drawing fire, the others striking from the side. We weaponize timing, angles, and speed." Miguel Rodriguez, still shaken from their near-death encounter that morning, nodded slowly. "Like matadors," he said quietly. "My grandfather took me to the bullfights in San Antonio when I was a boy." Novak pointed at him with the chalk. "Exactly. The Tiger has an 88mm cannon that can punch through our armor from over a mile away. But it has 2 weaknesses: slow traverse and limited visibility." He drew more arrows, demonstrating the coordinated dance of Sherman tanks. The lead tank creates a distraction: smoke, movement, anything to draw attention. Meanwhile, 2 more Shermans circle wide, approaching from opposite flanks. Jaime Walsh, clutching his Bible as always, spoke up. "But sir, won't the Tiger just rotate to face the threat?" "That's the beauty of it," Novak replied. "It can't track 2 targets moving in opposite directions. It has to choose, and while it's turning," he slapped the chalk against the Jeep's hood, leaving a white mark. "That's when we strike the side armor." A murmur rippled through the assembled men. For the first time in weeks, something flickered in their eyes besides resignation, a cautious, fragile hope. "This isn't just theory," Novak concluded, brushing chalk dust from his hands. "We did it today. It works." As the gathering dispersed, Chen approached Novak. "If this works consistently, it changes everything," he said quietly. "It has to work," Novak replied, glancing toward Rodriguez, who was showing a worn photograph to another crew member. "Otherwise, none of us are going home." In the distance, artillery flashed, briefly illuminating Captain Morrison's weathered face as he turned away, pretending he hadn't seen the unauthorized briefing that might just save his company. The dim light of a kerosene lamp cast long shadows across the weathered pages of Jaime Walsh's Bible. The young gunner from Iowa hunched over the sacred text, carefully transcribing Staff Sergeant Frank Novak's tactical diagrams into the margins of Psalms. His hands trembled slightly as he worked, not from fear, but from the weight of what these sketches represented. "You still up with that book?" Miguel Rodriguez whispered from his cot, the photo of his 4 daughters tucked beneath his pillow. Jaime nodded without looking up, just trying to make sense of things. The quiet farm boy had always found comfort in Scripture, but tonight, as artillery rumbled in the distance, he found himself questioning everything he believed. Was it blasphemy to mark these pages of holy text with diagrams of death? Or was there something divine in Novak's innovation, a path to salvation through geometry and physics? He traced the arc of a Sherman's approach angle, remembering how his father had taught him to plow straight furrows across their Iowa fields. Now he was calculating trajectories to pierce German armor, to kill men he'd never met. "My grandmother would say God works in mysterious ways," Rodriguez offered, sitting up in his bunk. "Maybe he sent us Novak." Jamie considered this. The former factory worker from Detroit had emerged as their unlikely savior, transforming their vulnerable tanks into weapons that might actually survive. Was this providence or just desperate human ingenuity? Outside their tent, rain began to fall on the Normandy soil. Jaime turned to Psalm 23, reading silently. "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." He wondered if courage came from faith or from Novak's mathematical certainty. Lieutenant Chen passed by their tent, pausing briefly in the doorway. "Walsh, you should get some sleep. Tomorrow we put the sergeant's plan into action." After Chen departed, Jaime closed his Bible, running his fingers over the leather cover. His mother had pressed it into his hands before he shipped out, promising it would keep him safe. Now he wondered if salvation would come through prayer or through the precise angles of Novak's Texas two-step. "Do you think it'll work?" he asked Rodriguez. The loader was quiet for a moment. "I think Novak sees things differently than most men. Maybe that's enough." Jamie tucked the Bible under his pillow and lay back, staring at the canvas ceiling. In the morning, they would test their faith, not just in God, but in Novak's calculations, in their own abilities, in each other. He closed his eyes, his prayers mixing with trajectories and firing solutions as he drifted toward sleep, uncertain whether tomorrow would bring deliverance or destruction. The morning fog clung to the Norman hedgerows as Staff Sergeant Frank Novak signaled his crew to ready positions. Dawn painted the sky in pale oranges and pinks above the crossroads near Pont Hébert, a deceptively peaceful scene for what was about to unfold. "This is it," Novak whispered, more to himself than to his men. First real test of the two-step. Inside their Sherman, Miguel Rodriguez's hands trembled slightly as he loaded the armor-piercing shell. The father of 4 crossed himself quickly, his thoughts momentarily drifting to the photograph of his daughters, tucked safely in his pocket. "Shell loaded," he reported, steadying his voice. Through the radio crackled Lieutenant David Chen's calm confirmation that his platoon was in position. The lieutenant had meticulously rehearsed the maneuver with his men throughout the night, leaving nothing to chance. His Sherman, positioned on the opposite side of the clearing, would serve as the second prong of their attack. Smoke deployed in 3, 2, 1. White plumes erupted across the field, obscuring visibility. Novak nodded to his driver, and their vehicle lurched forward, treads grinding through the soft earth. The plan was simple yet revolutionary. One tank would draw the Tiger's attention, while another approached from its vulnerable side. Through the haze, they spotted their target, a massive Tiger tank, its long 88mm cannon scanning for threats. The German behemoth, previously untouchable at long range, was now caught in Novak's carefully orchestrated trap. "He sees us," Novak warned, as the Tiger's turret began its slow rotation toward Chen's position. The German tank fired, its shell screaming through empty air, as Chen's Sherman had already shifted position, exactly as Novak had diagrammed. Meanwhile, Novak's vehicle emerged from the smoke at the Tiger's flank, precisely where the German tank's armor was thinnest. "Target acquired," Private Jamie Walsh announced, his Iowa accent thickened by concentration. The gunner's eyes narrowed as he peered through the sight, his Bible secured in his breast pocket. Walsh took a deep breath, steadied his hands, and squeezed the trigger. The Sherman rocked backward as their shell launched. A heartbeat later, it struck the Tiger's side with a deafening clang, followed by a shower of sparks. The German tank shuddered violently, then ground to a halt, black smoke pouring from its engine compartment. Silence hung in the air for 3 long seconds before erupting into a chorus of cheers across the American radio frequency. Men who had lived in constant fear of the German tanks now watched one disabled before them. "We got the bastard," Rodriguez shouted, his face splitting into a wide grin. Novak simply nodded, allowing himself a small smile. This wasn't about vengeance or glory. It was about survival. For the first time since landing in Normandy, the Americans had found a way to fight back against the mechanical predators that had haunted their advance. As the crew secured their position, Walsh quietly touched his Bible, whispering a prayer of thanks that wasn't for the kill, but for the lives saved. Captain Morrison stood motionless behind the field binoculars, his weathered face betraying no emotion as he watched the operation unfold from the makeshift command post. The morning fog had lifted just enough to reveal Novak's unorthodox maneuver, succeeding where traditional tactics had repeatedly failed. The disabled Tiger tank now sat like a wounded beast, black smoke billowing from its turret. "I'll be damned," he muttered, lowering the binoculars. The company commander had spent 23 years in the Army, following every rule in the book. Now he watched as Staff Sergeant Frank Novak's improvisation saved American lives and destroyed German armor. Inside the cramped tent that served as battalion headquarters, Morrison faced the cold reality of military bureaucracy. Major Phillips slapped a communique onto the wooden table between them. "This came down from regiment this morning," Phillips said, tapping the paper. "Any deviation from approved combat doctrine is to be documented and disciplined. They're concerned about chaos in the ranks if everyone starts improvising." Morrison ran a hand through his thinning hair. "With all due respect, sir, Novak's team just took out a Tiger that had us pinned down for 2 days. We lost 8 men following the manual." "The manual exists for a reason, Captain." "So do our men," Morrison countered, his voice quiet but firm. That evening, as artillery rumbled in the distance, Morrison sat alone at his field desk. He carefully traced Novak's original diagrams, adding his own notations about the successful engagement. The Texas two-step, as the men called it, wasn't just luck. It was sound tactical innovation born of necessity. He knew what this might cost him. 23 years of service, his pension, perhaps even a court-martial if his superiors decided to make an example of him. Morrison thought of Lieutenant Chen coordinating the flanking maneuver with precision, of Private Walsh's steady hand on the gun, of Rodriguez loading shells with practiced efficiency. He thought of all the men who might survive to see home again. With deliberate care, Morrison sealed the diagrams in an envelope marked Urgent Tactical Assessment and addressed it to Colonel Harrison at Division Headquarters. He added a personal note vouching for Novak's innovation and recommending immediate implementation across all Sherman units. "Sir," a young corporal appeared at the tent flap. "Radio message from HQ. They want names of any officers or NCOs deviating from protocol." Morrison nodded, dismissing the corporal. He looked down at the sealed envelope in his hands. After a moment's hesitation, he handed it to his runner with instructions for immediate delivery. "Some rules," he whispered to himself as the runner disappeared into the gathering darkness, "are worth breaking. Oberleutnant Karl Brandt lowered his binoculars and frowned. From his concealed observation post near the hedgerows outside Pont Aber, the German officer had witnessed something troubling. The Americans were adapting. "They're not following their own doctrine anymore," he muttered to his gunner, sketching quick diagrams in his field notebook. As an engineer before the war, Brandt approached combat with analytical precision, and what he saw disturbed him. The Sherman tanks, previously predictable in their frontal assaults, were now moving in coordinated patterns, flanking, feinting, using smoke as cover. 3 days earlier, his Tiger had claimed 2 American tanks with ease. The Shermans had advanced directly into his sights, their inferior armor no match for his 88mm cannon. It had been like shooting practice targets. But this morning's engagement had been different. The Americans had split their formation, used the terrain intelligently, and managed to disable Kruger's Tiger without taking a single loss. The German commander tapped his pencil against the page, recognizing the hallmarks of an engineer's mind behind these new tactics. Someone on the American side had realized that the Tiger's greatest strengths, its thick frontal armor and devastating firepower, came with inherent weaknesses: slow turret traverse, limited visibility, and poor maneuverability. "They're turning our advantages against us," Brandt explained to his crew that evening as they performed maintenance on their tank. He respected innovation, even in his enemy. The Americans were compensating for their tank's inferior armor and firepower with speed and coordination. It was elegant, really, a solution born of desperation. "What does this mean for us?" asked his young loader, fear evident in his voice. Brandt closed his notebook. "It means we can no longer rely on superiority of equipment alone. We must be more vigilant, more creative." He ran his hand along the Tiger's massive gun barrel. "This beast was designed to dominate through power and protection, but now we face an enemy who refuses to engage on those terms." That night, he radioed neighboring Tiger commanders with warnings and suggestions. The Americans had changed the equation, and the Germans would need to adjust. No longer could they count on Sherman's obligingly presenting their vulnerable fronts. As he settled into his cramped sleeping quarters, Brandt found himself wondering about his American counterpart, the mind behind this tactical shift. In another life, they might have been colleagues exchanging ideas at an engineering conference. Now they were locked in a deadly contest of innovation. The German officer fell asleep with a strange mixture of professional admiration and dread. For the first time since arriving in Normandy, he sensed the momentum shifting. The Tiger, once the undisputed king of the battlefield, suddenly seemed less invincible, and that realization was more terrifying than any artillery barrage. The muddy field surrounding Pont Aber became a testing ground for Novak's tactics, but innovation came with its own price tag. As 3 Shermans executed the Texas two-step against a concealed Tiger, the garbled radio transmission nearly turned allies into casualties. Lieutenant David Chen's tank, Rawhide 4, swung wide through the morning mist, exactly as planned. But when static consumed Novak's follow-up command, Chen mistook another Sherman for the enemy. "Target identified, 10 o'clock, Chen called, his gunner's sights already trained on the olive-green silhouette of Staff Sergeant Frank Novak's vehicle. "Hold fire," Novak screamed into his radio, frantically waving a smoke grenade outside his hatch. "Friendly! Friendly!" The lieutenant recognized the desperate signal just as his gunner's finger tensed on the trigger. Chen slumped back against his seat, face ashen with the realization of how close they'd come to killing their own men. "Radio discipline, gentlemen," Captain Morrison later reprimanded them, his weather-beaten face betraying both relief and concern. "Your trick works, Novak, but one miscommunication and we're writing letters home." Those words proved prophetic later that afternoon when Hellcat, the 3rd Sherman in their formation, took a direct hit during another engagement. The tank didn't burn, small mercy, but Corporal Wilson died instantly when shrapnel tore through the hull. That evening, as rain pattered against their armor, Miguel Rodriguez pulled a crumpled envelope from his jacket. The men huddled in their tank, faces illuminated by a single shielded flashlight. The loader's voice trembled as he read aloud his wife's latest letter from San Antonio. "The girls made a birthday cake for you," Rodriguez read. "Maria said you'd taste it in heaven if you couldn't come home for it." Jaime Walsh clutched his Bible tighter, whispering something that might have been a prayer. The gunner's faith seemed to waver with each passing day, each life taken and lost. "Wilson had a kid on the way," Chen said quietly from the shadows. "He showed me the telegram last week." Novak stared at the diagrams spread across his lap. His Texas two-step had saved dozens of lives already. The math was clear on that. But the equations couldn't account for human error, for radio failure, for the random cruelty of war. "We're still better off than before," he finally said, tracing the angles with oil-stained fingers. "But I need to refine it, make it foolproof." Rodriguez carefully folded his letter. "There's no such thing as foolproof in war, Sarge." The rain intensified, drumming against their steel shelter like distant artillery. Innovation had given them hope, but it couldn't grant immunity. Tomorrow they would try again, adjust the variables, and pray the cost wouldn't be measured in more telegrams and half-eaten birthday cakes. The smoldering Tiger tank lay at an odd angle, its massive gun barrel pointed uselessly skyward. Staff Sergeant Frank Novak approached cautiously, pistol drawn, as the commander's hatch creaked open. A white handkerchief emerged first, followed by the weary face of Oberleutnant Karl Brandt. Blood trickled from a gash on his forehead, but his eyes remained alert, assessing. "Your English?" Novak asked, maintaining his distance, as Jaime Walsh kept his rifle trained on the German. "Better than your German, I suspect," Brandt replied with unexpected composure. The German officer climbed down slowly, hands raised. His crew followed, faces grim but relieved to be alive. Later, in a makeshift interrogation tent, Novak sat across from Brandt. The standard questioning had yielded little beyond name, rank, and serial number. But Novak noticed something familiar in the way the officer studied the tent's support structure. The eyes of an engineer. "You weren't always a soldier," Novak said, sliding his own technical drawings across the table. Brandt glanced at the diagrams, a flicker of professional interest crossing his face. "Neither were you." "I built cars in Detroit before all this," Novak admitted. "Ford's River Rouge plant." The German nodded, a hint of respect in his expression. "Daimler-Benz. I designed cooling systems." Miguel Rodriguez stood guard nearby, fingering the rosary in his pocket, uncomfortable with this cordial exchange with the enemy. Yet he remained silent, trusting his commander's instincts. "Your Tiger," Novak continued, tapping the diagrams, "it's a masterpiece of engineering, but it has weaknesses." "As does your Sherman," Brandt countered. "Yet you found a way around ours." Novak leaned forward. "I'm not asking you to betray your country, but how many more young men need to die because of mechanical limitations we both understand?" The tent fell silent. Outside, the distant rumble of artillery punctuated the moral weight of the moment. "Engineer to engineer," Brandt finally said. "This isn't about politics anymore." He reached for the pencil, hesitated, then began annotating Novak's diagrams. "The turret rotation mechanism. It's over-engineered, precise, but slow. And here," he pointed to the rear armor section, "a persistent design flaw." Lieutenant Chen entered quietly, watching this unusual collaboration with cautious fascination. The officer had seen enough death to appreciate this moment of shared humanity. For nearly an hour, the two former civilians spoke the universal language of mechanics and mathematics, finding in their technical dialogue a brief respite from the war that had consumed them both. When Captain Morrison arrived to transfer Brandt to the POW processing center, he found not an interrogation, but a conversation between reluctant adversaries united by a common desire to end the senseless destruction their machines had been designed to create. "Auf Wiedersehen, Herr Engineer," Brandt said as he was led away. "Goodbye, Engineer," Novak replied, the diagrams now filled with insights that would save American lives. The dawn of July 28th brought a thin mist rolling across the hedgerows near Ponte-Bear. Staff Sergeant Frank Novak hunched over a map spread across the hull of his Sherman, incorporating the insights gleaned from Oberleutnant Brandt. The German tank commander had revealed crucial blind spots in the Tiger's design, particularly how the massive turret created a dangerous lag when tracking fast-moving targets from multiple directions. 3 points of attack, Novak explained to his assembled crew. Not just 2. He traced triangular patterns with oil-stained fingers. The Tigers expect the flanking maneuver now. We need to evolve faster than they can adapt. James Walsh nodded silently, his Bible tucked into his jacket pocket. The gunner had grown more confident with each engagement, his hands steady where they once trembled. "You sure this will work?" Miguel Rodriguez asked, his thoughts clearly drifting to the photograph of his daughters, safely tucked in his breast pocket. "Mathematics doesn't lie," Novak replied, the engineer in him speaking with quiet certainty. Word had come through that morning. An American reconnaissance unit was pinned down 3 miles south, with at least one Tiger holding position at a crucial crossroads. Captain Morrison had hesitantly authorized Novak's plan, knowing they had no better options. Lieutenant Chen coordinated the timing through crackling radio transmissions. His Sherman would approach from the east as a diversion, while Novak's tank would sweep wide to the west. The third element, a Sherman commanded by Sergeant Wilson, would hold back until the Tiger committed to one target. The attack began at precisely 1100 hours. Chen's tank roared forward, deliberately exposing itself just enough to draw fire. The Tiger's massive 88mm cannon boomed across the countryside, the shell narrowly missing its target. "Now!" Novak ordered through the radio. All 3 Shermans converged in a carefully choreographed dance. The Tiger's turret swiveled frantically, unable to track all threats simultaneously. Rodriguez loaded shells with practiced efficiency as Walsh lined up the shot. The gunner exhaled slowly, squeezing the trigger at precisely the moment Novak had calculated. Their shells struck the Tiger's vulnerable rear armor, followed seconds later by another hit from Wilson's tank. Black smoke billowed as the German crew abandoned their disabled vehicle. By nightfall, the reconnaissance unit had been rescued, and word of the successful 3-pronged attack spread through the ranks. Soldiers gathered around Novak's Sherman, no longer seeing the vehicle as a death trap, but as a weapon capable of victory. "You've changed the equation," Chen told Novak quietly as they shared rations that evening. "The men don't feel like sacrificial lambs anymore." For the first time since landing in Normandy, the American tankers slept without the crushing weight of inevitability. The hunters had become the hunted. Word of Staff Sergeant Frank Novak's success rippled through the American command structure like electricity. By July 28th, his unorthodox tactics had reached the desks of colonels and generals miles behind the front lines. The brass, initially skeptical, couldn't argue with results. 5 Tiger tanks disabled in 3 days, with minimal Sherman losses. In a command tent near Avranches, Colonel Harrington spread Novak's diagrams across a wooden table. "Brilliant work," he muttered to his aides. "We'll implement this immediately across all armored divisions." Then, almost as an afterthought, draft it as a tactical bulletin. Call it the Coordinated Flanking Maneuver Procedure. No mention of Novak. No credit for his crew. The Texas two-step was about to become anonymous doctrine. Captain Morrison stood in the back of the tent, his weathered face betraying nothing as he listened. The company commander had bent rules and risked his 20-year career by allowing Novak's experimental tactics. Now, he watched as the higher-ups prepared to erase the sergeant's contribution entirely. "Sir," Morrison interrupted, stepping forward, "with respect, this innovation belongs to Staff Sergeant Novak and his crew. Their names should be attached to the bulletin." The colonel's expression hardened. "Captain, doctrine doesn't have authors. It has authority." "These men risked court-martial to develop these tactics," Morrison persisted. "Private Walsh and Lieutenant Chen executed maneuvers that weren't sanctioned. Rodriguez loaded shells faster than regulations required. They deserve recognition." A major leaned toward Harrington. Sir, morale would benefit if the men saw one of their own recognized. The colonel drummed his fingers on the table. You disobeyed direct orders, Morrison. You allowed unauthorized tactical deviations. Yes, sir, I did. The captain stood straighter. And I'd do it again. The tent fell silent. Everyone present understood the implication. Morrison was placing his career on the line for his men. Later that afternoon, a jeep bounced down the rutted road to Novak's position. The sergeant was cleaning carbon from his tank's breech when Morrison approached with official papers. Congratulations, the captain said, handing over the document. The Novak-Chen flanking protocol is now official doctrine. Your crew will receive commendations. Frank stared at the paper, speechless. I might be busted back to lieutenant, Morrison added with a thin smile. Worth it. That evening, as Jaime read his Bible by flashlight and Rodriguez rode home to his daughters, Novak realized something profound. In war, innovation rarely came from the top. It emerged from desperation, from men who couldn't afford to fail. The Texas two-step would save countless lives, but more importantly, it proved that even in the rigid hierarchy of war, a single voice could change everything. As July drew to a close, the hedgerows of Normandy welcomed a new sound, the rumble of British armor rolling into position near St. Lo. Staff Sergeant Frank Novak stood with Lieutenant Chen and Captain Morrison as the convoy of olive-drab vehicles passed, their distinctive long-barreled main guns unmistakable even to untrained eyes. Sherman Fireflies, Morrison explained, a hint of relief in his weather-beaten face. 17-pounder guns. The Brits modified them to punch through Tiger armor at range. Novak ran his oil-stained fingers along the barrel of one tank as its commander, a British lieutenant with a handlebar mustache, offered a crisp salute. Heard you chaps have been giving Jerry a proper thrashing with standard equipment. Bloody impressive. The American sergeant smiled thinly. For weeks, his crew had been fighting with inferior firepower, surviving only through the unorthodox tactics he'd developed. Now technology had caught up to necessity. Later that evening, as the sun set over the Norman countryside, Novak gathered his crew. Jamie Walsh sat quietly with his Bible, while Miguel Rodriguez polished a shell casing he'd fashioned into a makeshift photo frame for his daughter's picture. They're calling the Firefly a Tiger killer, Novak told them. Same Sherman body, but with a gun that can penetrate a Tiger's front armor at 1,000 yards. Rodriguez whistled low. So we don't need the Texas two-step anymore? We always need smart tactics, Chen interjected, his voice carrying the quiet authority he'd earned over these difficult weeks. Better guns don't make better soldiers. Captain Morrison joined them, carrying a bottle of cognac liberated from a French farmhouse. Headquarters is incorporating your flanking maneuvers into the official tactical handbook, he informed Novak, pouring small measures into tin cups. Though they're calling it Coordinated Armor Engagement Protocol now. The men laughed, a sound that had become rare in their unit. To the Texas two-step, Morrison toasted, and the men who survived long enough to see it validated. As they drank, Walsh nudged Novak. You think God had a hand in this? The Fireflies arriving just when we figured out how to fight without them? Novak considered the question. I think we're meant to solve problems with what we have, not wait for miracles. But I won't complain about the reinforcements. The next morning, Novak watched his crew stand taller as they prepared their tank for the day's advance. They moved with the confidence of veterans who had faced the worst and survived through ingenuity rather than luck. The Fireflies would change the equation of battle, but Novak knew his men carried something more valuable than upgraded weaponry. They carried the knowledge that impossible odds could be overcome with enough courage to question doctrine and enough skill to rewrite it. Lieutenant David Chen watched the sunrise through a small gap in the hedgerow, the golden light catching on his Sherman's battle-scarred hull. The events of the past week had transformed not just their tactics, but something deeper within the ranks. For the first time since arriving in Normandy, he felt the weight of his command as a source of pride rather than burden. 3 months earlier, a colonel had pulled Captain Morrison aside, suggesting that men like Chen might be better suited for support roles. The words weren't meant for his ears, but walls in army camps were thin. David had responded the only way he knew how, with impeccable performance and silence. Now, that same colonel had requested Chen's presence at the next tactical briefing. "Lieutenant, your coordination during yesterday's engagement was textbook perfect," Morrison told him that morning, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "The Texas two-step needs someone who can time those flanking maneuvers down to the second. You've got that kind of precision." David nodded, his expression carefully neutral, despite the pride swelling in his chest. "Just applying what Staff Sergeant Novak taught us, sir." "No," Morrison countered. "You're improving it." As Chen walked through the temporary motor pool, he noticed the glances from other officers, not the sidelong looks of suspicion he'd grown accustomed to, but nods of acknowledgement. The previous day's operation had neutralized 2 Tiger tanks without a single American casualty. The radio operators were already calling it Chen's checkmate. Frank Novak approached, wiping grease from his hands. "Heard you're teaching the brass how it's done today." "They just want to understand the formations," David replied modestly. "They want to understand how you coordinated 3 platoons through terrain that had everyone else stuck," Frank corrected him. "Don't let them take that from you." Later that afternoon, Chen found himself surrounded by officers as he traced movement patterns on a map. He spoke with quiet authority, explaining how timing and communication overcame the Tiger's advantages. The questions came rapid fire, and he answered each one with precision. Among the gathered men stood 2 Nisei lieutenants from the 442nd Regiment who had been sent to observe. Their presence wasn't lost on David. His success was creating ripples beyond his own unit. That evening, a young Mexican-American tank driver approached him tentatively. "Sir, is it true you're being considered for Company XO?" "Just rumors," Chen replied. "Well, sir," the driver continued, "it matters to some of us, seeing you up there." David nodded, understanding the unspoken weight of representation. In the segregated army, his visibility had become something more than personal achievement. It was possibility made manifest. His quiet competence had done what no order could, forced recognition of worth based on ability rather than background. As darkness fell over the Norman countryside, Chen reviewed his maps one final time. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for tonight, his identity as a soldier and leader stood unquestioned. Victory had its price. As the sun set over the French countryside on July 28th, the men of the 745th Tank Battalion gathered around smoldering fires, their faces illuminated by flickering flames that cast long shadows across their weary features. They had survived another day, but at what cost? Miguel Rodriguez sat alone on an ammunition crate, his calloused fingers tracing the edges of a weathered photograph. The image showed 4 young girls with matching braids and gap-toothed smiles, captured in a moment of peace that felt increasingly distant. Frank Novak approached quietly, offering a steaming cup of coffee. "They're beautiful," Novak said, nodding toward the photograph. "My oldest turns 9 next month," Miguel replied, his voice barely audible above the distant rumble of artillery. "I keep wondering if she'll recognize me when I get home." He tucked the photo carefully into his breast pocket. "Sometimes I catch myself doing things I never thought I was capable of. Yesterday, when that tiger went up in flames, I cheered. Actually cheered as men burned alive." Novak settled beside him, his shoulders slumped with the invisible weight of command. The Texas two-step had saved American lives, 14 tanks and crews preserved by his innovation. But the German losses were mounting. Each victory left a residue of horror that no amount of tactical success could wash away. "I dream about engines," the tank commander confessed. "Not tanks, but the assembly lines back in Detroit. Simple, clean mathematics, parts fitting together exactly as they should. He rubbed his oil-stained hands together. But now my dreams have people in them, burning inside the machines. Around them, the other men showed similar signs of strain. Private Walsh had taken to reading his Bible for hours, lips moving in silent prayer. Lieutenant Chen maintained his composure in public, but had developed a persistent twitch in his right eye. Even Captain Morrison, who had finally embraced Novak's tactics, seemed to age a year with each passing day. "I'm afraid of what I'll become if this keeps going," Rodriguez whispered, staring into the darkness beyond their camp. "My father came back from the Great War a different man. My mother said he left his soul in France." He looked directly at Novak. "I feel mine slipping away too." Novak wanted to offer reassurance, to say that they would all return home whole, but the lie wouldn't form on his lips. Instead, he placed a hand on the loader's shoulder and sat with him in silence. Two men united by triumph and trauma, innovation and loss, the true mathematics of war that no diagram could capture. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a clean, sharp scent that cut through the usual odors of diesel and gunpowder. Staff Sergeant Frank Novak stood outside the makeshift POW processing tent, mud caking his boots. He'd requested this meeting, though he couldn't entirely explain why. When Oberleutnant Karl Brandt emerged, flanked by two American MPs, Novak noticed how similar they looked in stature. Both men shaped more by drafting tables than by military training. The German officer's hands, like his own, bore the calluses of someone who had built things long before he'd learned to destroy them. "They tell me you're heading to England tomorrow," Novak said, offering Brandt an American cigarette. The German accepted with a nod. "Better than the Eastern Front." He inhaled deeply. "Your trick with the flanking maneuver, it was elegant. We would have eventually adapted, you know." "That's what engineers do," Novak replied. "We solve problems until new ones appear." They walked a few paces from the guards, just far enough for privacy, but not enough to cause alarm. In the distance, mechanics worked on a damaged Sherman, the clanging of tools carrying across the field. "I designed improvements to the Tiger's turret rotation last year," Brandt said quietly. "Made it faster to target your tanks. Every time I saw a burning Sherman, I wondered if my modifications were responsible." Novak stared at the horizon. "I understand. At Ford, I helped streamline assembly lines. Now I use that same efficiency to coordinate killing machines." "We became soldiers," Brandt observed, "but we think like engineers, always calculating. The difference is, with machines, you can predict the outcome. With war," Novak trailed off. A silence settled between them, filled with unspoken calculations. Lives saved and taken, decisions made under pressure, the weight of responsibility that would follow them home. "My wife is expecting our first child," Brandt finally said. "A boy, perhaps. I wonder what world we're leaving him." Novak thought of Rodriguez's daughters, their faces smiling from a worn photograph. A complicated one. As their time ended, the two men faced each other. No salutes. Those belonged to different uniforms, different loyalties. Instead, they shook hands, a gesture between equals who recognized themselves in the enemy. "Good luck, engineer," Brandt said. "You too," Novak replied. As the German was led away, Novak remained still, watching. Two men from different sides, both caught in machinery larger than themselves, both haunted by the dual-edged nature of innovation. For a moment, they had found something rare on the battlefield. Recognition without hatred. Understanding without surrender. On July 30th, as dawn broke over the hedgerows of Normandy, the men of the 745th Tank Battalion prepared to advance toward Avranches. The morning air carried the scent of diesel and victory, something few had dared to hope for just a week earlier. Staff Sergeant Frank Novak stood atop his Sherman, surveying the column of tanks with quiet pride. His Texas two-step maneuver had transformed from desperate gambit to official doctrine with remarkable speed. Captain Morrison approached, holding a sheaf of papers. "It's official," he said, handing them to Novak. Your tactic is being implemented across all armored divisions in the European theater. Novak scanned the documents, noticing how his name appeared only in the smallest footnote on the final page. The brass had nearly erased his contribution, recasting his innovation as an extension of existing doctrine rather than the revolution it truly was. They're calling it Coordinated Flanking Protocol, Morrison added with a wry smile. Sounds more official than Texas two-step, I suppose. The tank commander nodded, unsurprised. Glory had never been his motivation. The real victory was in the faces of his crew. Jaime Walsh checking his gun sight with newfound confidence. Miguel Rodriguez writing home with stories of hope rather than despair. And Lieutenant Chen briefing his platoon with the authority his leadership had always deserved. Later that afternoon, as the battalion moved out, Chen pulled his vehicle alongside Novak's. "They may not put your name in the history books," he called over the engine noise. "But we know. We all know." The truth traveled through the ranks like wildfire. How a former factory worker had outthought German engineering. How a handful of men had changed the course of the campaign by daring to question doctrine. In mess tents and field hospitals, the story grew with each telling. Rodriguez captured it best that evening as they prepared for the push toward Avranches. "My father always said revolution comes from the bottom," he remarked, polishing a shell casing. "The big shots sign the papers, but the real change happens in the mud." Novak watched as other tank crews practiced his maneuvers in the fading light, their movements becoming more fluid with each repetition. The Texas two-step was no longer his alone. It belonged to every man who would live because of it. The official record might minimize his role, but the men who survived knew the truth. Real victory was won by those who dared to think differently, even when the world demanded obedience. And in that knowledge lay a legacy more powerful than any medal or citation could convey. The understanding that innovation could triumph over inevitability, and that courage sometimes meant challenging not just the enemy, but the very systems designed to defeat them. The war ended, but the echoes of those 6 fateful days in Normandy reverberated long after the final shots were fired. When tanks rolled off assembly lines in the years that followed, they carried with them not just the lessons of Frank Novak's improvisation, but the spirit of innovation that had saved countless lives. Frank returned to Detroit in 1946, his hands still instinctively reaching for diagrams whenever he faced a problem. The River Rouge plant welcomed him back, though few understood how the quiet engineer had transformed tank warfare an ocean away. At night, he would sometimes wake, hearing the distant rumble of factory machines and mistaking them for approaching tigers. Jaime Walsh returned to his family farm in Iowa, his Bible now filled with both prayers and tactical notations, a testament to how faith and ingenuity could coexist. He wrote to Frank twice a year, always ending his letters with, "Still hitting the target, thanks to you." Lieutenant Chen rose through military ranks, despite persistent prejudice, eventually helping design training protocols that incorporated the Texas two-step. His contributions ensured that Novak's innovation became standard doctrine, though official records often minimized the origin story. Miguel Rodriguez hung up his uniform and embraced his 4 daughters in San Antonio. The photograph he'd carried throughout the war, finally replaced by their living, growing presence. The nightmares faded more slowly than he'd hoped, but each year they grew dimmer. Captain Morrison, who had risked his career to champion Novak's unorthodox approach, received neither punishment nor recognition, the military's way of acknowledging he had been right without admitting its own rigidity. And somewhere in Germany, Karl Brandt rebuilt engines instead of tanks, occasionally wondering about the American engineer who had outthought him. They exchanged exactly 3 letters over 20 years, each one brief but weighted with mutual respect. In 1967, when Frank was asked to speak at a veterans gathering, he brought no medals, only a faded chocolate wrapper with his original calculations. The impossible is just the improbable waiting for someone to do the math differently, he told the crowd. Tigers seemed invincible because we approached them according to a formula that guaranteed our destruction. The story of how a former factory worker's insight turned the tide against Germany's most fearsome weapon became more than legend. It became a blueprint for approaching seemingly insurmountable obstacles. In military academies and engineering schools alike, the lesson was clear. Doctrine must serve survival, not the other way around. Frank Novak died in 1982, having never considered himself a hero, just a problem solver who refused to accept that some equations couldn't be balanced. But to the men who survived because of him, he had rewritten the laws of possibility itself.